In that gospel reading, the thing that really catches me is all children of God. We are all children of God, and that's why we take time today to think about our Indigenous siblings. All children of God. I'd like to talk a little bit about reconciliation. We throw that word around a lot, especially in the church, Indigenous reconciliation, but what is reconciliation anyway? Well, if you look at the definition, it's the act of causing two people or groups to become friendly again after an argument or a disagreement. It's about starting a new story of the relationship. Starting again. But I think some of us struggle with how we reconcile with people we maybe don't even know. Although Indigenous people make up 5% of the population in this country, many of us don't know an Indigenous person. Or if we do, we don't realize we do. So I thought I'd pass on what I have been doing this week in terms of praying and thinking and also researching. The beauty of the internet is you can know Indigenous people just by Googling and watching a video. And some of the Indigenous people that I do know have said that they are tired of telling their story again and again and again, because every time they retell it, they go through the pain again. And they said, there's lots of stories, you could just go and watch them. So I commend that to you. But a couple of things that really came to mind to me this week. And the first was about language. Now, those of you who are my age and older will know that we've used different names for Indigenous peoples in this country over the decades. And sometimes it can be hard to keep up with what's the right thing to say. But that's a first simple act of reconciliation, of friendly relations, to be aware of the words you use. You see, a simple but important act of friendship is to call the other person by their right name. And I hope you know that we're not going to use the words Indian or Native. Christopher Columbus called Indigenous people Indian because he thought he landed in India. And we're not going to do that anymore. And Native suggests that people are somehow less or primitive than natives. Not a good word. And the word Aboriginal has taken on some of those connotations, although it is still used in some circles. Many of you have used the word First Nations, and that is perfectly correct, but it does not include every Indigenous person in Canada. The Métis people are not considered a First Nation. The Inuit consider themselves the people, not the First Nation, and so it doesn't cover them either. So that's why we're using the word Indigenous. And the word Indigenous, talking about definitions, it simply means something or someone inhabiting or existing in a land from the earliest times. And Indigenous people all often say they have lived in this land since time immemorial. And that's the very definition of Indigenous. So then, what do we call people who are not Indigenous? People like me. And the usual term is settler. And a settler is not a bad person. Well, they might be, but that's just humanity. So if your ancestors have been here since time immemorial, then you're Indigenous. And if you or your ancestors came to Canada from another country, you're a settler. Whether a first-generation settler like me, or a settler whose ancestors came here in the 1600s, I think in Newfoundland they would say you came from away. Secondly, I think about our personal responsibility for reconciliation. I think many of us personally feel we've never done anything to harm an Indigenous person. Some of us don't really know them. But still we pray many times when people crossed the seas from other lands. They broke the circle of God's creation by their greed and violence, and they shattered the lives of others. And that greed has benefited all of us. We all live on that land. So that turned me to finding out a little bit, a tiny little bit, about the history of this land. And it takes me to the Treaty of 1818, it is Treaty 18 in fact, the Lake Simcoe-Wasaga Treaty of 1818. It was made between the Chippewa near Lake Simcoe and the colonial government of Upper Canada. Treaty 18 outlines the surrender of 1,592,000 acres of land. That's the land from Collingwood and Wasaga Beach all the way down to Bradford, in exchange for an annual payment of £1,200 in goods, in perpetuity, like around $2,000 a year. It doesn't seem like a fair trade to me. So the Chippewa, who are part of the Anishinaabe Nation, signed a treaty with the Crown, that's England, to give away their rights to 1.6 million acres of land for $2,000 a year. Now, according to Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's an Indigenous author of a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which I highly recommend, she says that the concept of taking everything from an ecosystem, harvesting everything, and leaving nothing for the next person or the next generation was and is outside Indigenous teaching. So can you imagine those people's dismay when the first people came and cut every single tree and floated them down the Wasaga River and took the wood away to England? Every single tree. I think they were expecting to share the land, and instead we kind of destroyed it. The next thing the government did was survey the land and divide it into little pieces, and they sold that land that they got for $2,000 a year, and they sold it to lots of settlers. Some settlers got their land in exchange for the service they gave in the War of 1812. And that land has been sold and resold over the years, and it became the little lots that we live on and the land that this church sits on. And the Indigenous people, well, what happened to them? Well, their population was decimated by European diseases like measles and smallpox. And they retreated to the remaining bits of their land that they did not give up in the treaty, and some live there today. These are the people of Rama First Nation, Bosloy First Nation on Christian Island, and Georgina Island First Nation. Maybe this is the point to say that about half of Indigenous people in Canada live in urban areas, and when I worked in the public service, I worked alongside them. They were lawyers and policy analysts, accountants. Well, that's one thing to know, is that you can't tell who's Indigenous to this land or not unless you know their story. But what I found amazing in working with my Indigenous colleagues is that they were actually willing to seek reconciliation with us. After we pushed them off their land, killed them with disease, tried to destroy their culture and way of life, removed their children and put them in residential schools from which many did not return, where a public inquiry had to be called because over 1,000 Indigenous women and girls were murdered or missing, and no one seemed to care. So for reconciliation, I think we start with learning more of the story. And we learn enough to help write a new story. A story of respect and love, caring and empathy. So as we pray today, we may renew the circle of the earth and turn the hearts of all people to one another. We are all children of God. John's gospel began with God's story for all of us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him. Without him, not one thing came into being. Jesus came to write a new story of love in the world. And we are all called to be part of that story, to write our own stories of love and caring in this world, to be part of the story of reconciliation. I'd like to close with something by one of my favorite Indigenous authors, a Cree called Richard Wasaga. He wrote, "All that we are is story. From the moment we are born to the time we continue on our spirit journey, we are involved in the creation of the story of our time here. It is what we arrive with. It is all we leave behind. We are not the things we accumulate. We are not the things we deem important. We are story, all of us. What comes to matter then is the creation of the best possible story we can while we're here. You, me, us, together. And when we can do that, and we take the time to share those stories with each other, we get bigger inside. We see each other. We recognize our kinship. And we change the world one story at a time. Thanks be to God.